I found the divorce papers in our mailbox 4 days after my oncologist said the word malignant out loud for the first time, and for about 30 seconds, standing in our driveway in my pajamas, I genuinely thought someone was playing an unbelievably cruel joke on me. It wasn't a joke. My husband of 12 years had filed for divorce the same week I was diagnosed with stage 2 breast cancer, and he'd done it, I would later learn, with a level of preparation that made clear he'd been planning this exit for considerably longer than the 4 days between my diagnosis and those papers landing in our mailbox. My name is Rebecca, and this is the story of the single worst month of my life, and the 18 months afterward it took me to rebuild something resembling stability, both physically and legally, while fighting two separate battles that arrived, devastatingly, at almost exactly the same time. I want to explain what our marriage looked like before that week, because I think it matters to understanding just how blindsided I actually was. Mark and I met in our late 20s, married at 31, built what I genuinely believed was a solid, comfortable partnership over 12 years together. We didn't have children, a decision we'd made together early in our marriage after some difficult conversations about my own complicated feelings toward parenthood, feelings Mark had always told me he respected and shared. We had a comfortable, if unremarkable, life. A house we'd bought together 6 years earlier, stable careers, the kind of ordinary, functional marriage that doesn't generate dramatic stories, right up until the exact week it very suddenly did. I found the lump myself, during an ordinary shower, on an otherwise unremarkable Tuesday evening. I want to be honest about the specific terror of that discovery, the particular quality of fear that settles into your body when you find something your fingers instinctively recognize as wrong before your conscious mind has even fully processed what you're feeling. I told Mark immediately, and I remember him being genuinely, visibly concerned in that first conversation, holding me while I cried, promising he'd be there for whatever came next. I remember, specifically, sitting on the edge of our bed that evening, Mark's arms around me, both of us Googling statistics about lump characteristics and likely outcomes with the particular frantic energy anyone who's faced this kind of frightening uncertainty will recognize. He booked my initial appointment himself the next morning, insisted on driving me there despite my protest that I could easily manage it alone, small gestures that, at the time, felt like exactly the kind of partnership I'd always believed our marriage was built on. The following weeks involved the exhausting, frightening process anyone who's navigated a cancer diagnosis will recognize: the initial mammogram, the follow-up ultrasound, the biopsy, each step compressing an already anxious waiting period into an even tighter, more agonizing timeline. Mark came to the first two appointments with me. I want to note that specifically because it matters to understanding the whiplash of what happened next. He sat beside me during the mammogram consultation, held my hand during the ultrasound, asked the radiologist thoughtful, engaged questions about next steps. Whatever was happening beneath the surface of his behavior during those weeks, it wasn't visible to me at the time, and I don't think, looking back at it now, that I was simply failing to notice obvious warning signs. I think Mark was, for whatever reason, deliberately maintaining the appearance of a supportive partner right up until the moment he'd apparently already decided he no longer intended to actually be one. The diagnosis came on a Thursday afternoon, delivered by my oncologist, Dr. Whitfield, in the careful, measured language doctors use when they need to convey something devastating without allowing panic to completely overwhelm the practical information a patient needs to actually process. Stage 2 invasive ductal carcinoma, she told me, treatable, with a genuinely strong prognosis given how early we'd caught it, but requiring an intensive treatment plan, surgery, followed by chemotherapy, followed by radiation, a process that would consume the better part of the following year of my life. Mark wasn't at that appointment. I want to explain why, because at the time, his absence felt like ordinary bad timing rather than anything more significant. He'd had an important work commitment that day, one we discussed and mutually agreed shouldn't be rescheduled given how many other appointments he'd already accompanied me to throughout the preceding weeks. I drove myself home from that appointment, called him from the car, and delivered the news over the phone, my voice shaking through the entire conversation. I remember his response carrying what sounded like genuine shock and concern, promising he'd be home early, that we'd figure everything out together, language that, in the moment, felt exactly like what I needed to hear from my husband on what remains, even now, one of the worst days of my entire life. He came home that evening, and for the following 3 days, his behavior remained, on its surface, appropriately supportive, attentive during conversations about treatment options, present during a difficult call with my parents to share the news, engaged in the kind of practical logistics conversations that inevitably follow a diagnosis like this: insurance details, work leave considerations, the beginning of a treatment calendar that would reshape both our lives for the following year. I want to describe the specific, disorienting shock of finding those divorce papers, because I think the mundane setting made the moment somehow worse rather than easier to process. It was an ordinary Monday morning, for days after my diagnosis, and I was checking our mailbox before a scheduled pre-surgical consultation, still moving through the particular fog of the preceding devastating week, when I found a thick envelope from a law firm I didn't recognize, addressed to me, containing a formal divorce filing Mark had apparently submitted 3 days earlier, the day after my diagnosis, though before he'd delivered any of the supportive, engaged behavior I'd witnessed. Over the following 72 hours, I stood in our driveway, still in my pajamas, reading through pages of legal language my brain could barely process given everything else it was simultaneously trying to absorb, and the specific detail that finally broke through my initial numb shock was the filing date, printed clearly at the top of the first page, filed the day after my diagnosis, meaning Mark had known, throughout those following 3 days of apparently supportive behavior, that he'd already initiated the legal process of ending our marriage, all while continuing to sit beside me discussing treatment plans and insurance logistics as though we were building a shared future together rather than a future he'd already, secretly, begun dismantling. I called Mark immediately, my hands shaking so badly I could barely hold my phone steady. He didn't answer. I called 4 more times over the following hour, each call going straight to voicemail, before he finally called back, his voice carrying a strange, careful neutrality that felt, in retrospect, like the voice of someone who had been rehearsing this exact conversation for considerably longer than the 4 days since my diagnosis. "Rebecca, I think we should talk about this in person, not over the phone. You filed for divorce the day after I found out I have cancer, Mark. You need to explain that to me right now." The silence on the other end of that call stretched long enough that I genuinely wondered if the connection had dropped. When he finally spoke, his voice had lost even the careful neutrality of a moment earlier, replaced by something that sounded almost clinically detached. "I've been unhappy in this marriage for a long time, Rebecca. I know the timing looks terrible, but I need you to understand this isn't actually about your diagnosis. This is about decisions I'd already been working through before any of this happened." I want to try to describe the specific vertigo of that sentence, being told, for days after learning I had cancer, that my husband's decision to end our marriage predated my diagnosis, but had simply happened to formally materialize at the exact same moment I most desperately needed stability and support. Whether that timeline was genuinely true or a convenient explanation constructed after the fact, I still don't fully know, even now, well over a year removed from that phone call. What I do know, with complete certainty, is that whatever internal process led Mark to that filing, he chose to execute it during the single, most vulnerable week of my entire adult life, and continued performing supportive engagement in the days immediately following, apparently unwilling or unable to have an honest conversation with me before hiding behind formal legal papers instead. What followed over the next several weeks was one of the most surreal, disorienting periods I've ever experienced, forced to simultaneously navigate an aggressive, time-sensitive cancer treatment plan alongside an increasingly contentious divorce proceeding, two entirely separate, entirely devastating processes that happened to be unfolding in complete parallel, each one demanding significant emotional and practical energy at exactly the moment I had the least capacity to provide either. I want to describe what I learned over the following weeks about the actual timeline and preparation behind Mark's decision, information that emerged gradually through the discovery process my divorce attorney initiated once it became clear this wasn't going to be a simple, amicable separation. Mark had, according to financial records and communications my attorney was able to obtain, been meeting with his divorce attorney for nearly 2 months before my diagnosis, working through the practical details of separating our joint assets, including detailed financial planning around the house we'd bought together and our various shared accounts. I sat in my attorney's office, my hair already beginning to thin from the first rounds of chemotherapy, reviewing email correspondence between Mark and his attorney dated weeks before I'd even found the initial lump in the shower, planning conversations about property division and asset separation that had apparently been actively underway throughout the exact period I believed we were building an ordinary, stable life together. I remember one specific email, dated nearly 7 weeks before my diagnosis, in which Mark asked his attorney directly about the cleanest way to handle the house, given how things currently stand between us. Language that made unmistakably clear he'd already reached some internal decision about ending our marriage well before any external crisis provided a convenient explanation for the timing. Reading that email, sitting in Diane's office with a chemotherapy port still visible beneath my sleeve, produced a specific, sickening clarity, Whatever narrative Mark had offered about the timing being coincidental, the documentation told a very different story. One where he'd been quietly building toward this exit for months before my diagnosis simply happened to arrive in the middle of his already underway planning process. He was already planning this, I said, more to myself than to my attorney, a careful, sharp woman named Diane who had clearly handled contentious divorces before, but who, even she later admitted, found the specific timing of this particular case unusually difficult to process professionally. This whole time, while I was getting my mammogram, while I was waiting for biopsy results, he already knew he was leaving. "I want to be direct with you," Diane told me during that same meeting. "The timing here, while devastating, doesn't actually change the legal proceedings in most respects. But it may matter significantly for how we approach negotiations, particularly around any claims of undue emotional distress or bad faith conduct during the settlement process." What emerged, over the following months of increasingly difficult negotiations, was that Mark hadn't simply been planning an ordinary divorce. He'd been strategically structuring the timing and terms to minimize his financial exposure, apparently understanding correctly that filing before my treatment fully began would allow him to argue for a property division based on our financial circumstances prior to the significant medical expenses my treatment would eventually generate, rather than accounting for those costs as part of any fair, ongoing settlement consideration. I want to be direct about how devastating this specific detail felt once I fully understood it. Mark hadn't just chosen terrible timing for an otherwise ordinary, if painful, divorce. He had apparently identified my diagnosis as a specific financial opportunity, understanding that filing before treatment began would legally position him more favorably than filing afterward, once the true financial scope of my medical needs became fully clear. The divorce proceedings themselves stretched across nearly 10 months, running and exhausting, demanding parallel alongside my surgery, 6 rounds of chemotherapy, and the beginning of my radiation treatment. I want to describe what it felt like, sitting in deposition meetings between chemotherapy sessions, my body simultaneously fighting cancer and fighting for basic financial fairness in the dissolution of a marriage I genuinely believed, right up until that Monday morning in our driveway, was solid and permanent. Mark's legal strategy, throughout the entire process, focused heavily on minimizing his financial obligations, including an aggressive push to have the house we'd purchased together sold quickly, an outcome that would have required me to find new housing during the exact period my treatment demanded maximum stability and minimum additional stress. My attorney fought this specific proposal successfully, ultimately securing an arrangement that allowed me to remain in the house through the duration of my treatment, with the actual sale and asset division delayed until my medical situation had stabilized enough to navigate a housing transition without directly jeopardizing my treatment or recovery. I want to describe one particularly difficult day during this process, a scheduled mediation session that happened to fall the day after my 4th chemotherapy infusion, when I was still deeply nauseous and exhausted, sitting across a conference table from Mark and his attorney, trying to advocate for basic financial fairness while simultaneously fighting the physical aftermath of treatment that was, quite literally, trying to save my life. Mark, throughout that entire session, maintained the same careful, detached professionalism he'd displayed since that initial phone call, discussing asset division and financial logistics with a clinical efficiency that felt, to me, almost unbearably cruel given everything happening simultaneously in my body and in my life. "I need you to understand," I told him directly, during a brief pause in that mediation session, unable to maintain my own composure any longer, "that I am fighting for my life right now, and you are fighting to make sure that fight costs you as little money as possible. I don't think you understand how that actually looks from where I'm sitting." He didn't have a meaningful response to that. I don't think there was one available to him that wouldn't have required acknowledging something about his own conduct he apparently wasn't prepared to confront directly. The divorce was finalized just over 10 months after those initial papers appeared in my driveway mailbox, roughly 6 weeks after I completed my final radiation treatment. The settlement, once fully negotiated, allowed me to remain in the house for an additional transition period, provided a division of our joint assets that my attorney described as fair given the circumstances, though far from what you rightfully deserved given how this all unfolded, and included a specific acknowledgement, embedded in the final agreement's language, of the medical circumstances surrounding the proceedings, a detail Diane had insisted on including specifically to establish a clear record given how unusual and, in her professional assessment, ethically troubling the underlying timeline had genuinely been. I want to describe what my actual treatment experience looked like. Running alongside this entire legal battle, because I think it matters to understanding just how much simultaneous weight I was carrying throughout that entire year. My surgery, a lumpectomy followed by 6 rounds of chemotherapy and then radiation, proceeded according to my medical team's careful, structured plan, and I'm grateful, now, well over a year removed from diagnosis, to be in full remission, my most recent scans showing no evidence of disease. But I navigated nearly the entire physical experience of fighting cancer. The surgery, the nausea and exhaustion of chemotherapy, the fatigue of radiation, the specific psychological weight of confronting my own mortality directly for the first time, largely without the partner I'd expected to be beside me throughout that process. Instead, navigating an increasingly adversarial legal battle running in complete parallel to my medical treatment. My mother moved in with me for nearly 4 months during the most intensive phase of treatment, providing the practical, daily support I'd once assumed Mark would be the one offering. She drove me to every chemotherapy appointment I couldn't manage myself, sat with me through the worst of the nausea, learned to recognize the specific signs that meant I needed help before I could even ask for it. My sister flew in for my surgery specifically, sitting in the waiting room throughout the entire procedure, the same role Mark had, before everything unraveled, promised he'd fulfill. I remember waking up from anesthesia to find her holding my hand instead and feeling a strange, layered grief, genuine gratitude for her presence, tangled together with the specific ache of it not being the person I'd originally expected to be there. I want to acknowledge, clearly, that I was fortunate to have this alternative support system available, understanding that not everyone facing a similar betrayal during a medical crisis has family members positioned to step into that gap the way mine were able to. I think about this often, particularly during the harder stretches of my recovery, understanding how much more isolating this entire experience could have been without my mother and sister's willingness to reorganize significant portions of their own lives to be present for mine. My friends, too, showed up in ways that helped fill the space Mark's absence left behind. A rotating schedule of meal deliveries during the worst weeks of chemotherapy, someone always willing to sit with me during infusions when my mother needed a break, a level of community support that, while it never fully replaced the specific partnership I'd expected from my marriage, taught me something important about the different, equally valid shapes genuine care and commitment can take. It's been just over 18 months since I found those divorce papers in my driveway. I remain in full remission, continuing regular follow-up scans that, so far, have shown no evidence of recurrence. I've since sold the house, on my own terms and timeline, rather than the accelerated schedule Mark's initial legal strategy had pushed for, and moved into a smaller apartment that feels, in a way I didn't fully anticipate, like a genuinely fresh start rather than simply a consolation prize following everything that happened. I don't speak to Mark anymore, beyond the occasional, necessary logistical communication that inevitably follows even a finalized divorce. I've heard, through mutual friends who still occasionally update me, that he's dating someone new, a detail that produces, when I hear it, a complicated mixture of genuine indifference and a lingering, quieter anger about the specific way our marriage actually ended, not through some slow, mutual drifting apart, but through a calculated legal strategy executed during the single, most frightening week of my entire life. I think, often, about the specific cruelty of that timing, understanding now, with the benefit of everything that emerged during discovery, that Mark's decision wasn't simply poor timing colliding accidentally with my diagnosis. It was, as far as the evidence eventually suggested, a deliberate strategic choice, understanding that filing before my treatment fully began would position him more favorably in the eventual financial settlement. Treating my cancer diagnosis not as a devastating medical crisis requiring his support, but as a financial variable to be managed and minimized before it grew too costly to ignore. If you've ever faced a serious health crisis and discovered, at the exact same moment, that the person you expected to support you through it had actually been planning their exit, I want to hear how you found the strength to fight both battles simultaneously. I used to believe that facing something as frightening as a cancer diagnosis would naturally bring a marriage closer together, that genuine crisis reveals a partner's true character in ways that inevitably deepen commitment rather than expose its absence. I've learned, in the hardest possible way, that sometimes the person who should be your strongest support during the worst moment of your life is instead already calculating, in the background, exactly how to minimize what that moment will eventually cost them.